So we have two old plywood sheets that we would like to turn into a multiplayer pinball table using a hobby level CNC router and the tools we have made for our workshop. Previously we have made a couple of cool looking pinball table designs and it was a lot of fun playing them. And we were thinking of ways to make a pinball game that's even more fun. Every once in a while we get emails from people asking if we could make something similar to the two-player pinball table created by the Get Hands Dirty YouTube channel. The game table they had built was remarkable and we didn't want to copy them. But then I discovered a problem that all pinball tables have. The feature layout is fixed in place. So in many cases you couldn't rearrange the field layout without leaving joint pockets or screw holes in the middle of the game field. And that's when I had the idea of making a small, simple and versatile pinball game. So after a couple of hours of designing, I came up with a pinball table like this. The layout is super simple. It has only a launch pad, a wall that guides the ball into the field, and flippers. You can add wooden dowels in the base panel holes, attach rubber bands to them, and create unique game layout. This way there are plenty of game field options for a single table. But that's not the best part. I also came up with the idea of having a hook slotting joint at the back of the table. The small detail means that we can remove the back panel and attach different game field extensions. For example, a two-player module that allows you to join two individual pinball games into one. Or you can also add a 3 or 4 player module. And that can turn a small pinball table into the ultimate game field. At this point I was really excited to build a new game and test it out. And we had this old plywood at our workshop that was perfect for the pinball table. However, there were a couple of problems. First of all, it had a lot of cracks and knots. It's annoying, but it also looks good. Then it was warped quite a bit. It didn't worry me much since the pinball table components are fairly small. However, the biggest issue was the dirt hidden in the grains of the plywood surface. And we can't clean all of it out, which means we will need quite a bit of router bits to cut this project. Anyway, the first thing I had to do was cut the plywood into smaller sheets that would fit on the CNC router. After that, I decided to sand the surface of each sheet. Typically you wouldn't do the sanding before the CNC cutting, since the sandpaper leaves tiny abrasive particles in wood that will harm your router bit's blade. But in this case the plywood was full of dirt anyway, and the sanding wouldn't make it much worse. Before we start cutting the first components, I wanted to test the cutting approach that allows you to cut parts without using support tabs. If I figure this out, I could save a lot of time on removing the support tabs. So I did some test cuts with a compression router bit. The goal was to figure out the settings that would leave enough wood chips into the cutting groove so the components would stay in place when doing the final pass. And after the first couple of test cuts, I noticed that the router bit threw all of the wood chips out of the groove. I realized that the material might be too thin for this approach to work. However, I had the idea of trying the same cut settings using a straight flute router bit. This seemed to be working better, and the router bit left just enough wood chips into the groove so the parts stayed in place. With the exception of the little imperfection here, the test cut was successful. So I will be using the same approach when cutting the pinball table parts. To attach the warped plywood to the CNC table, I first placed a couple of screws at the side of the sheet and had the CNC drill holes for the hold down screws in the places where the offcuts would be. Then, going from one side, I placed the hold down screws. It straightened the plywood quite well. And then I let the CNC do its thing. On this sheet there were components for 2 pinball tables and the total cut time was a little less than an hour. While the CNC was running, I was sanding the plywood for the next operations and the workshop got quite dusty. To avoid the dust clouds, we will have to make a downdraft dust collector sometime in the near future. When the first cut was done, I was surprised at how well the components were held in place by the wood chips. It was almost impossible to remove them. And after removing the sheet from the CNC, I realized that for some of the outlines the cuts hadn't gone through the plywood. To fix that, I added an offset to the tool paths that will make the cuts a little deeper. And I loaded the next sheet on the CNC and went to remove the components from the first one. At first I tried using a chisel. However, it wasn't as effective I would have liked, so I took a jigsaw and carefully traced the cutting grooves. This was way faster. Then I noticed sparks flying across the CNC table, and I went to investigate. After removing the dust collection, I noticed that the router bit had turned dark and there were burnt chips in the cutting grooves. That wasn't good. Luckily, the dust collection hadn't picked up any of the sparks, since that might cause a fire to break out in the workshop. But the good thing was all of the passes had cut through the plywood, and it was super simple to remove the components. Then I changed the router bit to a new one and cut the next sheet. In the meantime, I was working on the components I had already made. But then it all went dark. After getting the electricity back online, I noticed that the CNC had cut in the middle of the trim router's cable. I had a poor cable organization. Well, 100% my fault. Anyway, we got that fixed by cutting out the damaged part of the cable, stripping the wires and conductor insulations, joining the matching conductors, and covering it all up using some heat shrinking tubing. And I got back to work. I ran out of the dark old plywood that we had, so I had to use a different one for some of the components. This plywood had the same thickness and it was cleaner than the sheets we had used so far. However, it was delaminating and the veneers were splitting apart. The old plywood components were done and it was time to cut the flippers. I made them using an offcut of regular birch plywood, but the new wood didn't go well together with the old one, so I painted the flippers in different colors. I also decided to paint the pop bumper dowels. To paint the dowels more efficiently, I made small discs that would hold the dowels. The jig allowed me to dip them in the paint all at once. And then it was time for assembling. First, I attached the game field features. I used dowels to position some of the components. The ones we had were too long and they were sticking out from the bottom. So I removed them using a crosscut saw. A Japanese saw would have been better for this job, but I haven't got one yet since we just started our workshop. Then I could attach the side components and secure them in place with wedges. After that, I assembled the components for the flipper mechanism and attached the front panel. Before attaching the back wall, I had to install the ball guide. I probably should have done it when installing other game features. It was time to install the flippers. However, the fresh colored ones still didn't look good enough. To match with the game field, they had to look old and shabby, so I sanded the paint a little bit, and the result was way better. Then I inserted dowels in the mechanism holes. These will be used for the rubber bands that drive the button and flipper mechanisms. When attaching the rubber bands to the flipper mechanism, the red rubber band for the button must be stronger than the green flipper mechanism band. That's why I attached 2 of the red bands. That will ensure that the flippers work smoothly. It was time to install the ball launch mechanism. It's simple and it requires only 3 components and a rubber band. Finally, we had to install the bumper dowels and some rubber bands. I love the idea of using the dowels as game field attributes. It makes it easy to adjust the game layout, and also it gives you the freedom to come up with your own attachments and game features. Oh, and I attached some rubber bands to the flippers as well. These will help to bounce the ball better. Finally, it was time to test it out. It's a lot of fun, however we had to try the multiplayer options. The middle attachment was easy and fast to build. The only challenge was sanding the edges of the game field panels. They had to be at a slight angle, otherwise there would be a noticeable gap on the game field. For that I used the disc sander that we built last time, and it made the job a lot easier. When designing the multiplayer extensions, I decided to add dowel holes to the game field panels. This will make the game even more customizable. The 2 and 3 player attachment modules were ready, so we attached the pinball tables and tried them out. We also made 5 and 6 player attachment modules. By the way, this is how the pinball table would look when built from new birch plywood. Anyway, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.